Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance further within the Kursk region, gaining control over the town of Sudzha and some of the surrounding areas, while Ukraine has turned a complete collapse into a fighting retreat, somewhat organizing themselves here in the final parts of the Kursk region. But it does not change the fate of Sudzha and the surrounding areas, as Russians will end up regaining control of it at the current rate. The Russians also managed to advance east of the Uska River line towards Borova, to the west of the Serebets River line, north of Liman, west of Bilorivka, as well as north of Soledar near Sako Ivanseti. The Ukrainians managed to regain some positions near Toretsk as well as to the south of Pokrovsk, while the Russians continued offensive operations north of Velika Novosilka and have managed to regain some positions near Kamyansk in the southwest of the front line. Starting out in the Kursk region, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Sudzha itself, gaining control over the central parts of the town, as well as the northern parts, pushing the Ukrainians back into Siverskyi, Goncharovka, and the western parts of these towns. So Sudzha itself and the entire eastern bank of the river line is under Russian control, while the Russians continue offensive operations from the northern flank and eastern flank of the town. The Russians are here looking to gain full control, with only these two towns remaining, following which there are a few villages between the defensive lines and the border area. The final fighting over Siverskyi as well as Goncharovka will determine the outcome of this offensive. The Ukrainians currently turned from a complete collapse, where the soldiers are simply leaving as fast as they can to get out of the Kursk region, to a fighting retreat where the forces that have left the border didn't just go across and stop functioning. Instead, they turned into a defensive maneuver, reorganized, and are now covering for the Ukrainian withdrawal out of the Sudzha direction. The Ukrainians are using MLRS, artillery strikes, and so on the Russian positions within Sudzha. At the same time, some of the forces remaining within the Kursk region have now turned to defense, where their objective is to hold on for as long as possible, while the remaining forces attempt to withdraw from the region. It is reported that the Ukrainian forces during their withdrawal were taking heavy losses from heavy Russian bombardment, both from the Russian Air Force, but also artillery and FPV drones, with their supply line completely under Russian control prior to this offensive. It was very difficult for the Ukrainians to withdraw safely, and this caused a lot of difficulties for them. However, the Ukrainians are somewhat stabilizing the situation with the forces that withdrew from the Kursk region. They've sent them to the flanks, where they are holding their positions to prevent a complete encirclement of their forces. The Russian offensives that took place in the Sudzha direction following the initial push, we see that the Russians managed to gain a bridgehead across before the Ukrainians were able to organize their positions. This forced them to withdraw from Sudzha as well, gaining control over the central areas, and attacking the flanks of the Ukrainian forces allowed them to make additional crossings here further north. And the Ukrainian withdrawal from Sudzha also allowed the Russians to gain control over Podol to the south. This forced the Ukrainians to hold two positions, the Siverskyi direction and the Goncharovka direction, both of which are somewhat disconnected from Sudzha itself, with the forest lines and river lines here in the northern parts, and the river line itself moving through the area between Sudzha and Goncharovka. We see that the Ukrainians had some sort of natural defensive positions that they could make use of, some geographical advantages. However, the Russians continue with their high momentum and will likely capture the remaining towns within the next few days. The Ukrainians are here attempting to get out as many soldiers as possible, save as many lives as possible, because they've given up the notion of keeping their bridgehead across the border area and into the Kursk region. This means that the Ukrainians are now making a decision, and that decision is to give up on the Kursk region now that they've lost the vast majority of it. Only about 12% remains of their peak, and this is practically nothing because they have no logistical hub, they have no potential for further offensive operations within the Kursk region. Any additional forces being sent are doomed to be destroyed instead, because their only supply line is within operational control of the Russians, and the Russians have significant forces concentrated in the area to kick out the Ukrainians, and this means that any further forces being sent in would be walking right into a meat grinder, and therefore the Ukrainians made the right decision to withdraw their remaining forces out and to cover for their retreat to save as many lives as possible to live and fight another day. The Russians with this will have full control over the Kursk region. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians made several advances, including here to the north of Borova, gaining full control over Siverskyi and entering the outskirts of Bohuslavka, fighting along the river line here north of the town, the Olosova River, as they continued advances along the railway as their main axis of advance. The town of Siverskyi itself is a gray zone, as no forces from either side are able to occupy the buildings, but the forest patches and forest lines to the west of the town is where the real fighting is taking place. This advance here was located with the geolocated footage and therefore confirmed with visual evidence. Moving down south to the direction of the west of the Siverskyi River line, the Russians made two advances, one along the forest lines here west of Ivanivka, getting within close proximity of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians by the second line of defense here northwest of the Siverskyi River line, and a secondary advance here west of Novolyubivka along the forest lines and forest patches along the border area between the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, where they are flanking the rear of the fortified positions to attack them from their weak point, and along the cover of the forest lines and forest patches to the rear of these positions. They also are aiming to cut off the connection between the two fortified lines by attacking both of them from different directions in between them, taking advantage of their ability to attack in both directions and squeezing the Ukrainian forces in between their positions in the center to the Siverskyi River line in the east. They are also encircling the Ukrainian forces in their positions along the forest patches in between their western and eastern flank, allowing them to cut these forces off and then launch further offensive operations on both flanks. The Russians are here looking to expand their bridgehead across the Siverskyi River line, securing further positions alongside the first and second defensive lines, and expanding the ability to supply their forces across the Siverskyi River line for further offensive operations, both in the direction of Borova to the north and Liman to the south, as well as operations along the Siverskyi River line itself in the direction of Sarishina and Torsk. The Russians managed to advance here west of Bilorivka in a second consecutive day, where they are attacking along the forest lines, expanding their presence and looking to advance towards the fortified positions south of Bilorivka and onwards towards Serebrianka and then towards Siversk. However, as earlier predicted, these are going to be small advances that will be taking place consistently over a longer period of time, as these are smaller groups of infantry walking through the forest lines, attempting to evade drones, and then taking up positions that are fortified once they get within close proximity to them. This will be very difficult fights for the Russian forces, but it is definitely more sensible than launching armored convoys that end up getting wiped out due to the Ukrainian ability to defend here in the Siversk section of the front line. In the direction of Sankoye-Vansety, the Russians gain control of the remaining parts of the highway all the way up towards Fedorivka and their fortified positions alongside the highway. With this, the Russians may be launching further offensive operations on the southern flank of Siversk, or it could simply be positional fighting to improve their positions here in the northern flank of Soledar. The Ukrainians managed to capture more positions here in the southern flank of Toretsk within the southern district of the city. The Ukrainians managed to gain control over the school here in the southwestern parts of it. This was also geolocated with this footage here, confirming the Ukrainian presence as they were under fire by Russian forces. Here in the western direction, south of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over the majority of Lysivka. Lysivka at this point can be considered a gray zone because of the back and forth that happens. Russian forces in the northern parts of the town, the Ukrainian forces in the southern parts of the town. Heavy fighting continues, and it's very dynamic. Moving on to the southern section of the front line near the north of Velika Novosilka, the Russians advance in the direction of Vizele along the forest lines as they continue their offensive operations northwest of Skutny following the capture of the town, and with the control over Dnipro and Nehiria, The Russians will likely launch further offensive operations towards Vesely along the main road and along the eastern bank of the Mokrieli River line as they continue offensive operations towards the final line of defense in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. Further west here in the direction of Kamyansk, the Ukrainians were pushed back here on the southern flank of the town, where the Russians gained control over some of the first lines here in the area, as is seen with the geolocated footage. You'll see that there's also some back and forth in the Siverskyi section of the front line, where sometimes Russians make some advances, like in the direction of Siverskyi and now Kamyansk, as well as areas such as Nasirenka. These are simply positional fights to improve their positions and prevent the Ukrainians from taking advantage of their previous gains by regaining control over all of these areas and improving their own positions, and this has allowed them to make significant progress, regaining control over a majority of the areas as they were prior to the Ukrainian offensive in 2023. However, no serious offensive by the Russians have been launched in this direction, and this means that there's been no significant changes. If we give a quick overview of the frontline situation, we see that the Russians are on the offensive in multiple areas. The Russians are looking to regain full control of the Kursk region, then potentially enter the Sumy region, following which we see that the Russians have offensive operations in the direction of Kupiansk, direction of Borova, along the Siverskyi River line, west of Bilorivka in the direction of Siversk, and then the Ukrainians currently have the initiative in the direction of Toretsk and south of Pokrovsk with their constant counterattacks. The Russians continued offensive operations in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region, north of Velika Novosilka, and there's some positional fighting in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line. Based on this, we see that the Russians are on the offensive everywhere across the front line, except for one part where the Ukrainians are on the offensive, here south of Pokrovsk and near Toretsk. It will be interesting to see what sort of effect the fall of the Kursk region for the Ukrainians would have on the front line, because based on the results in terms of casualties, we may see differences across the front line. If the Ukrainians have taken a lot of losses and the Russians have barely taken any, then the Russians would gain a significant advantage from this development. If both sides have taken a decent amount of casualties about equal to each other, then it will have practically no effect on the front line. If in turn the Russians have taken a lot of casualties and the Ukrainians remain unscathed from this offensive, then they would be able to redirect their forces and strengthen their offensive operations in the east. However, based on the footage we have seen and the developments in the area, it is likely that the Russians have remained fairly unscathed, with the Ukrainians taking the bulk of the casualties due to the Russian air supremacy as well as their rapid movement. It seems that the Ukrainians were largely caught off guard, not expecting such a large offensive operation, and this allowed the Russians gain a significant advantage at the start. The Ukrainians will attempt to inflict as many casualties on the Russians as possible during these final remaining days. However, it is unlikely to be near that the Ukrainians have suffered, and therefore the Russians will likely gain an advantage in other sections of the front line due to how the situation unfolded in the Kursk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.